So once upon a time, long, long ago, kids didn't used to play video games all day. Do you remember that? I'm sure you do, because I do. Barely. And I can see that many of you here are much older than I am. What did you do with your free time back in those ancient pre-digital era days? If you're at all like me, you were outside. And today, we don't spend enough time outside. And when we do, we don't do it in the right way. We should be spending our time outside not only in nature, but with nature. It shouldn't surprise any of you here that 82% of our natural landscapes are impacted on an annual basis worldwide by humans. And over 1 billion people worldwide depend directly on these natural resources. In fact, humans have had such a long-standing impact on our natural landscape that conservationists have a difficult time determining what these natural landscapes should even look like. Like many of you here, I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time in the wilderness growing up. And I was fortunate to have 2 parents who are teachers, so we were able to drive around during the summer and visit many of the iconic places you might see in a wall calendar or in a desktop background. Among many of these places were the national parks across the U.S. They had a great activity for 5-year-olds like myself at the time. It was called the Junior Park Ranger Program. You received a booklet upon entering the park, and in the booklet, it had a set of tasks that had a certain methodology to them. You were to hike down certain trails, travel to different areas, try and find animal tracks, pick up trash, and observe the natural landscape, and learn about it from your book. Learn about the natural area over there while you stayed in their designated area here. My parents thought this opportunity would give them some free time, but in all reality, what actually happened is I began to learn the art of procrastination, while they learned how difficult it was to convince a 5-year-old to finish a workbook at 9 o'clock the night before you're leaving a park by candlelight at a campsite. Not long after my time earning Junior Park Ranger merit badges, little pieces of plastic, something like these right here. Not long after earning several of these badges, I joined 40 million other adolescents worldwide in the scouting program. This program was great. I got to spend more and more time outside, hiking on trails, backpacking, and setting up campsites. We learned about our natural landscapes. We learned about Native Americans and about the history of both the U.S. and the world and what we have done to these natural places. We read about them. We looked at them from afar as we hiked. We were able to set up campsites and leave them alone without damaging the natural landscape. Again, there was still something missing the whole time. Throughout all my time in scouting, I just felt a pit in my stomach. We had been learning for so long, I had been learning for so long about these natural landscapes, but there was still some divide that existed. As I finished up my time in scouting, and I earned the rank of Eagle, I began to look at different colleges and institutions to go to. And I figured if I could finagle my way into spending some more time in the woods instead of going away to school yet, I could maybe fill this little pit I felt in my stomach. So I enrolled in a program called NOLS, National Outdoor Leadership School. It was a semester-long immersion program in New Zealand. It was an absolutely fantastic experience. I'd never been so close to nature in my life. We learned how to hike down trails and through terrain that I'd never thought existed. We learned how to set up camp and take it down in a flash. We learned natural orienteering, and we were trained in something called Leave No Trace, in which adheres to 7 different principles that some of you may know. Things like staying on well-worn trails, not taking from the natural environment, and not leaving anything behind you. But still, even after all that, I still felt some sort of void in the pit of my stomach. Upon returning to New Jersey, I had just spent 87 days backpacking, mountaineering, and sea kayaking, living out of a tent in some of the roughest terrain that I knew existed. I regarded myself as a true nature master. Or so I thought. Not long after returning to New Jersey, I enrolled here at Ithaca College and came to Ithaca. A friend of mine introduced me to this thing called primitive skills. Now, if you could put myself on a scale at that time, my nature mastery was something like 90% of all there was to know. Sure, I hadn't had an opportunity to save the whales yet. I hadn't climbed Everest, but I was getting there. So I figured, sure, I'll spend a couple weeks and I'll learn this thing called primitive skills. I'll spend some time in the woods with these people, and I'll learn what they have to offer. As I spent more and more time learning these primitive skills, I began to realize that my nature mastery might not be so masterful, that my 90% might be a little skewed. I began to become humbled. My 90% moved down to something like a 50%. And as weeks and weeks passed, I realized there was quite a bit of information that existed over here, quite a bit of awareness that existed in these natural landscapes, where previously I was just observing it from afar. My scale moved down, and eventually what happened is the scale just changed. The whole dynamic just changed. What I realized is that there's lifetimes of knowledge that exists over here when you're participating in the natural environment, instead of just observing it from afar. I was not a nature master. I was not an outdoor master. I was not even a novice. What I thought was everything was not even a scratch in the surface of the amount of knowledge and wealth to be gained from spending time in these natural areas. What I learned was the beginning of my treatment of something called NDD. Again, some of you may have heard of this before. It's called Nature Deficit Disorder. A man named Richard Louv came up with the term. He wrote a book called The Last Child in the Woods. He hypothesized that people, especially children, are spending less and less time in the outdoors, and it's causing a broad range of behavioral problems. But wait, hadn't I spent enough time in the outdoors? Well, I did, but it wasn't in the right mindset. I didn't have the right perspective. My nature connection grew into a nature obsession. Shelter, water, fire, food. These are 4 elements of survival, and what people knew for 10,000, for 100,000 years, and I wanted to know them as well as they did. This is what kept humanity alive and brought us to where we are today. I wanted to gain all of these skills so that way I could be closer and closer to this natural landscape over here, so that I could feel my way over this fence and feel what it's like to spend time in nature. As I began to learn more and more, I began to realize something. There's just too many of us. There's too many people on Earth, and if we all started running around trying to learn these naturalist skills, we would likely damage these natural landscapes that we have left, these few areas that remain. There's over 7 billion people in the world, and it's estimated that if we all lived like hunter-gatherers, Earth can only withstand 100 million people. So clearly we're not going to go back to the Stone Age, nor do we want to. But what can we do? Leave no trace still at that time made sense. We had caused so much damage for so long to our natural landscape. For hundreds of years, for thousands of years, we've been logging, and we've been causing damage. And it wasn't until the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when the nature conservation movement took off, we decided to put up a barrier, a red line, a fence between us and the natural landscape over there, and keep us here. Because if we cross this, we might hurt it, we might damage it, or even kill it, as we had been doing for so long. But now we're starting to come back. Come back to Ithaca, New York. On one of many weekends I spent learning these naturalist and primitive skills, I was on a tree walk with a skilled mentor of mine. We were in a national forest not far outside of here in Ithaca. As we walked down a trail with a group of people, he took us down a slope, up a steep embankment, and towards an old-growth oak tree. Growing right up next to the oak tree was a small maple sapling, growing up about half the length of the tree. My mentor gathered the whole group of us around, and he crouched down next to the tree. He looked up at the top of the oak tree and down to the base, up to the top of the maple and down to the base of the maple. He intended to teach us about the oak tree and its effect on the natural landscape around us. But before that, he casually just took out his handsaw and began cutting away at the maple, and over it fell. And I flipped. What did you do that for? It was a perfectly healthy maple tree. This is a national forest. How could you damage it? What are you doing? And he stopped me. Of course, I probably used a lot more expletives at the time. But he stopped me, and he looked up at me, and he said, "Oh, this sugar maple was damaging this oak. The forest is better off without it." And I stopped. How could leaving a trace be a benefit? How could leaving something behind, damage, be a benefit to this natural landscape? So I went back to research. I talked to many of the mentors of mine, and I began to learn that oak tree was being damaged by the sapling as the wind passed through it. The sapling would rub away at the branches of the oak tree and had to dedicate energy to trying to overgrow those torn areas to prevent disease. The sapling also sucked nutrients away from the base of the oak tree, so the oak was not able to dedicate as much time and nutrients towards producing more acorns. More acorns, now that the sapling was gone, meant that there'd be more rodents in the area. More rodents meant more foxes, and more coyotes. And more rodents and more acorns mean that those acorns are moved further and further away from the base of the tree, and that those acorns will grow into more oak trees and help the forest overall. That one small act done in the correct way with the correct knowledge was an absolute benefit to that natural landscape. Leaving a trace in that case was a benefit. So why don't they teach all of us this? Why don't we all know these skills? Because we don't value them as a society. Because we don't teach them in education systems. We don't even have recess in many states now, let alone spending time outside in nature or with nature. Conservationists worry about mass impact of people. After all, again, there's 7 billion of us and growing. But why don't we look towards something like mass benefit? Imagine this. You look at 2 different items here. You have studies like what Richard Louv is doing, and many individuals like him, that are determining that naturalist skills and spending time in nature is a benefit for kids and adults alike, not only reducing obesity rates, reducing rates of ADD, ADHD, reducing stress, and making them happier and giving them exercise outside. Not only does that side of the coin exist, but on the other side, if properly trained, mass impact could be great in benefiting these natural landscapes and helping them grow back faster. What would take hundreds of years for a forest to naturally regain its original growth could be done in decades or begun even sooner with the proper help from a forester or from a conservationist. So if we begin to train and teach kids these ideals, like Richard Louv would suggest, you could think about the mass impact of that. There's over 55 million grade school children in the US. What if you took 10% of that population, 5.5 million kids, and you began to teach them these naturalist skills? Not only would they be able to affect the children and the kids around them, but they would have an understanding that would carry with them for the rest of their life. Whether they choose to spend time and create a positive impact doesn't matter, but it would send ripples through everyone that exists in society. And there's institutions doing this now. There's nonprofits across the country, hundreds of them, that are working and teaching these kids these naturalist and primitive skills, and some right here in New York. They're growing at an exponential rate. The natural world has always been a farm for us, for humans. It's always been a garden, and we've always been part of it. Why should it be any different now? Why should we put up a barrier? You can help mend the influence that we have had on the natural landscape for so many years. You can leave a trace with the proper knowledge and help the natural world regrow. You can and should, with the proper knowledge, leave a trace. Thank you.